gosh, we realize how much of the capability and the planning for the British Army, for example, is completely out of date to the point of being redundant.
What do we know about this latest bombardment?
Well, it's a huge bombardment, and it seems that Russia is beginning after a pause, beginning to put in a major effort along the south and in Donbass. They seem to have been thrown off balance by an unexpectedly strong counterattack, whether it's going to develop into a full counteroffensive at Kherson. If the Kherson counterattack works, it means that Russia can kiss goodbye to dominating the whole of the Black Sea coast this year. And it is just possible that Ukrainian forces now could threaten the Russian presence in Crimea. It's part of the way things tip and swing, but it also looks from what Zelensky has just been saying in the last few hours, the Russians are preparing at the same time a major offensive to take the last bits of the Donbass.
And so, I mean, Robert, it does feel that, the issue of Ukraine has slightly fallen, but, in terms of the news agenda, we're talking about other things now. But it obviously sounds like it's still very much happening. There's lots of things happening. As you say, Russia's thinking about gearing up. Do you think that we have slightly taken our eye off the ball on Ukraine? Do you think that there is a bit of fatigue setting in?
As far as the news agenda is concerned, absolutely yes. It's been very fickle on this because now we're getting into a very difficult part, a very serious part as to how this now, through the next stages, develops into the long war. And that's very much what it's looking like. Excellent piece by Mark Galeotti in the Sunday Times, sister paper, this morning, explaining how there's no way back for Putin now. Putin's view of the big Russia at the center of European politics is based on conquest, on smashing the opposition. And this means that he seems to be quite unstable in his purpose now, which is just all-out conquest and damn the consequences, which makes a lot of Europe fragile. I think, by the way, with the Mykolaiv bombardment, we must now throw into question yet again as to whether they will get any of that Ukrainian grain out of the Black Sea.
And Robert, I mean, you've said there that this sort of juncture might be the beginning of this very, very long dug-in period. I mean, how long do you think this could go on for? And do you think that we in the West fully understand the consequences of that? Of course, the military consequences, the humanitarian consequences, and of course, the economic consequences.
Well, I think it's very difficult to discern, and I'm not jabbing fingers or blaming anybody. My ex-editor, old editor, and very good friend, Max Hastings, had a very good column in the Times yesterday about this, saying that in the old school of thinking, and he was going back to Kissinger and Clausewitz, the great Prussian, to great effect, saying that in a way, Putin looks as if he's got all the cards. He's got the big guns, he's got the big numbers, and that he can just go grinding on. But if you turn Max's argument on the head, and it's a very interesting one, you say, actually, given the realities of the communication age, of informal warfare, of the dark war that's being fought through the electronic spheres, which is a real novelty, and they're all finding it very hard to truly come to grips with, then this is really very, very much up in the air. And one of the worst case scenarios, and it's an enormous paradox, if there is some dreadful collapse in Russia altogether, where the social as well as the political and military fabric collapses, and it is just possible within a few months, I would just quickly answer your question. Rishi Sunak, Liz Truss, going to be prime minister of this country. By the time they're seriously looking at a general election, maximum 2 years' time, the Ukraine war will still be going on.
It's such an important point, Robert, that you make there. And I mean, just in terms of the leadership contest, I want to come back to Max Hastings in a minute. I mean, do you think anything will substantially change as a result of who becomes the next leader?
Whoever the leader is, Aisha, has got to take a very, very important decision. That I think Liz has mentioned it, and so has Sunak in a different way. They're going to have to spend more, not huge amounts, but more on defense, because defense needs to go through a rapid somersault of reform because of these new dimensions of war that have been revealed by Ukraine. And one insider, actually in uniform, said, gosh, we realize how much of the capability and the planning for the British Army, for example, is completely out of date to the point of being redundant.
And final question to you, Robert. You mentioned Max Hastings. I remember an article that Max wrote. It was probably a few months now, but it really stuck in my brain because he made a powerful, maybe realistic, but unpalatable argument where he said, look, at some point, we might have to accept that a sordid deal might have to be done to stop all of this. And it was quite controversial. A lot of people pushed back against it. But do you think he maybe had a point?
It's a very strong point that Max makes, and he stood with that. He stood with it yesterday. And I disagree with him because he tried to lay out again the terms in which actually Ukraine would be persuaded to give up a large chunk, and it would be Donbass and quite a bit more, and then they could settle. The point is that neither side, the forces are so badly apart at the moment that the Ukrainians are prepared to lose in territory, but they will go on fighting a guerrilla war of resistance. This will be one of these on-off, frozen, and then wars that suddenly crops up, which we're seeing too much of across the world. Russia has got at least 3 points on its borders. We see it in the Middle East. It's not the way war is constituted, because it's constituted more by peoples rather than governments and armies. And this is the thing that is proving so tough for Russia, because Russia can put 250,000. They've got about 250,000 committed to Ukraine now, but they're barely managing to hold down, to occupy the land that they've taken, particularly in Donbass. And this is the story, without using absolutely unacceptable terror, almost genocidal tactics of eradication.
Well, listen, Robert, as ever, a real pleasure to speak with you and get your expertise. Thanks very much for your time this afternoon.
Thank you.
That's Robert.